I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today. Our webinar is on social norms measurement and evaluation, and we know how valuable your Zoom time is, so we're really going to do our best to make sure this time is very worthwhile for you. There's tremendous interest in social norms today, in part because evidence shows that norms shape behaviors related to sex, family formation, violence, and other outcomes far into the trajectories of young people's lives. We also know that investing in social norms change through, as well as supporting policies and access to high quality services, can bring about significant improvements in the lives of young people. But measurement is a really important part of this work, increasing our understanding of what's needed, what works and what doesn't, and how to improve our policies and programs. Next slide, please. Our meeting today will feature French interpretation. So if you would prefer to engage in French, you can find the interpretation bottom at most likely the bottom or possibly the top of your screen. You'll see a little sort of globe, as you see here on the slide. To access it, you just click on it, and you can see options for off, English, French, or mute. Choose a language you'd like to hear, and you'll hear the interpreters throughout our webinar today. If you have any issues or any problems, just give us a chat to let us know. Next slide, please. This event is the third webinar in the Passages Legacy series, designed to distill and share evidence and resources to improve the implementation, evaluation, and scale up of normative approaches. Passages is a 7-year USAID-funded implementation research project, which ends in September of this year. We aim to address a broad range of social norms at scale to achieve sustained change in voluntary family planning, reproductive health, and gender-based violence. The insights we'll share today, and indeed the entire Passages legacy, is a product of the creativity and dedication of our consortium partners, FHI 360, Save the Children, Cheer Fund, the Johns Hopkins University Global Early Adolescent Study, and PSI, along with the contributions of many of you who are on our webinar today. Next slide. We'll begin today with big picture remarks on the state of the field, where we've been, how it's evolved over the last 7 years. That will be followed by remarks from my colleague, Bryan, who will share some of the learning and resources from Passages on measurement and evaluation. Finally, we've invited 3 colleagues who've been instrumental in advancing social norms practice to share their perspectives in a prelude to setting up a conversation with all of you on where we should head next. Before we say goodbye today, we'll ask you to vote on a series of measurement topics to prioritize areas for further discussion via small consultations. Next slide. As you can see here, we're joined by a group of eminent and generous social norm scholars. Bryan and Susan Igras from IRH at Georgetown University will represent Passages. We also welcome Ben Cislaghi, Sarah Lapsansky of UNICEF, and Lydia Murithi of Pathfinder. Next slide, please. With that, I'm very happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Ben Cislaghi from the London School of Health and Tropical Medicine. Ben's thinking has guided and inspired Passages from its inception when he participated in our earliest technical advisory group meetings. I'm sure many of you are aware of his insightful writings on social norms. And it's over to you, Ben. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us once again.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to give this keynote, for which so we've been discussing a little bit, and I have to confess I was given a bullet points list of the things to say to you. But because I am Italian and by definition my essence is mischievous, I went a little bit around that bullet point. And let me start actually with an archetype in the academic tarot that I think is particularly helpful here. The tarot is the post-normal scientist. This is a great paper, by the way, that I really suggest for all of you to have a look at. I wanted to start my time. So this archetype of scientist is suggested that the post-normal scientist recognizes that problem definition, the choice of what gets measured and how, the choice of what gets measured and how, that is how values are defined and how decisions regarding these incommensurability are resolved. The choice of what gets measured and how intrinsically entails, should be, I guess, a normative and political aspects and requires a sharp critical sensitivity to these norms. So this means I'm embodying this archetype in these keynotes by saying my perspective will be, our choices about measuring social norms, are they themselves the product of social norms? Okay, the choice of what we measure and how comes from disciplines, come from all this cultural background that we bring in. And I'll say a little bit more about it. Particularly, it comes from a strong belief in Western knowledge as being superior to indigenous knowledge. And my invitation this is a picture I've taken when I worked in West Africa for a few years, specifically in Senegal. This is the village where I lived for a bit. But the point is, and I usually use this picture to reflect on how actually the Western measurement and the Western goals and the Western apparatus that is embodied by Western-led organizations that are large and democratic because they hold a lot of power, but not the accountability of those who are elected to hold that power. So all that Western power is often inadequate or colonial when it comes to adapt to indigenous lives. So then the question is, as we decide to measure norms with an eye of the hyper-educated or the Westerners or the people living in the global North or the people educated in the global North or the people educated in the urban global South, but in the big universities, when we decide to use those measures to understand social norms in indigenous populations, how are we ourselves aware, self-reflective, and aware of what we're measuring and how? How are we going to validate those results? So the first point really speaks, and it's a general point, really speaks to the importance of connecting with the population, collecting data together with the population that the interventions are designed for, if not even to have this data collection, data design led by those populations. Otherwise, we're mostly serving the capitalist development juggernaut that doesn't do much to help with our measurement issues. I will go through this, but this is quite interesting as well. So in the West, there is this idea of the self as being kind of a vase, right? And each of us is a vase. Now, our social norms tend to be more about how do I make sure that my vase, in this case, my ego, is not broken. So I know right now that I'm presenting to you, I shouldn't pick my nose. And I don't want I don't want you to see me picking my nose, because otherwise my ego will be shattered by the idea that you might think that I'm not a serious academic. A lot of indigenous worldviews, this is the Maori paradigm, but the Patanjali yoga paradigm is also fascinating. And there is many that you can read. Ulrich, child well-being framework for indigenous child well-being. So this idea of the self as being a vase is compromised and says this is not true. And then we're all bound. We're bound in our community, in our family, with nature, with the spirit, with the ancestors. So this system of norms is not just as we experience it in Manhattan, where right now that my ego is compromised. But we're talking about places where the system of norms really creates a connection that is deeper, that goes beyond and after this life, goes beyond and after my family, my community, if not even reaching out to the spirit. So then how does this get knitted actually, or in the large embroidery of life that much Western arrogance interpret as being the building of a house, right? Very often we think of intervention as if we were pharaohs building a pyramid, and we say, with this intervention now, I will make change. But that's delusional. And that's where the social norms work happens so much, because we are weavers knitting a thread in this tapestry of people's lives, in people's lives that are connected not only among themselves in space and time, but even beyond themselves. So how does the social norms measurement then is capable and able of following that thread in the quilt, in the tapestry, in the embroidery of this complex social fabric that connects people across space, time, generations? And that is obviously fundamental, right? So social norms are time and space bound, and they can, you know, if in the 60s, the hippie movement created a strong set of norms, and it's almost incredible to think where those norms, now those norms are bound to small communities, and we have a much more right-wing, exclusionary, oppressive global narrative, right? So norms do change, and measures allow us to understand what is going on. And of course, we don't need, because we're quite culturally competent at the global level, at least those probably who have access to the internet. So we don't need to collect a lot of data to realize that the hippie movement and the movement for peace and love is not exactly what's guiding global policy today, and global politics, I should say. But then how do we understand what is happening within this generation, within this village? What is the dominant normative narrative about? Should we actually be helpful to each other? Should we take care of our children in a way that allows them to become future parents, or rather the norms right now are shifting towards an individualism where the point of the children is not to become the bearer, the new generation of this indigenous population. The point is that each and one of them needs to go to school and become very rich and support the family. There is an interesting argument about indigenous populations being matriarchal, because the children makes the difference. When we think about children as collective, so the norm is children are the future of the community, the survival of the community, then the society becomes matriarchal because women are taking care of children. When instead children become the one, they need to have individual success, going to school, become president of the republic, the society tends to switch over being patriarchal. So really measuring social norms allow to understand what the hell is going on within a given society. And as I mentioned, sometimes we need a lot of evidence, sometimes we don't need a lot of evidence. Cultural competence is dependent on the observability of the event. These are two terrorist fascist events, the bombing of Aleppo on the left and the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. So if you want to understand whether something with such an important cultural ripples is happening, you don't need to interview actually and measure, have a great amount of data for that. But of course, to understand the microcosm of norms, to understand possibly norms that are shifting within small groups, you might need a greater amount of data. Not just to understand where the norms are shifting, but how norms are shifting. This is something called the diagram of return potential that Jackson put out, J. Jackson. Is an old model, but it's very interesting. Look, what this model is saying is that the disapproval of conformity with the norm is only to a certain point. So say, for instance, you don't drink alcohol. Well, you might be disapproved until you reach the right amount of alcohol. But if you over comply with the norm, if you drink too much, then you're disapproved again, right? So this is the kind of measurement that we need, not just dichotomic, yes, norms, no norm, but really what is the level of effect of the norm, and to what extent is the norm affecting changing in people's actions. You might be interested to understand, and I think this is my second and last slide, that of course, when certain behavior is private, such as brushing your teeth, the influence of social norms might be reduced. But when instead is public, such as jaywalking or not, with the Beatles in the picture on the right, well, when the behavior is public, then the influence of social norms might much be stronger. So really having data to understand how are norms changing norms affecting changing practices is going to be effective. And this is my last slide, actually. There is a hierarchy, of course, of knowledge and data, with quantitative and RCT data being considered the golden standard. I will suggest that's perfectly fine, but how we're collecting, again, going back to my first, data with populations and qualitative participatory evidence in a way that is led by the population themselves, so that the people that you're serving can tell you how and when social norms are changing. And I'll stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. I think we're going to put back up our slide deck. Okay, thank you very much, Ben, for this discussion. And we ask for your words because we know that you're always going to have a very interesting take that really goes well beyond and often challenges our suggested bullet points that we had for you. My name is Bryan Shaw, and I'm going to very briefly discuss some of our experiences through the Passages Project in assessing this field of social norms measurement and evaluation, as well as gaps in these topics. Some of the social norms measurement techniques and evaluation methodologies for norm shifting interventions that we've used in our work. And again, this will be a brief overview, and we'll likely get the opportunity to go over many of these techniques and methodologies more in depth in a series of planned follow-up workshops. So next slide. So first, let me tell you how we think of social norms in the Passages Project and thereby measurement of social norms. We've been talking a lot about social norms this morning, and I believe that we have yet to define what they are according to Passages. And to help us in this task, we often distinguish social norms from individual attitudes. So we see two types of social norms. Descriptive norms is a behavior typical of a community, and injunctive norms is a behavior approved of by an individual's reference groups or important others who are influential for that behavior. So in a highly relevant example for today, for example, a descriptive norm measure might ask, is wearing face masks in public typical among adults in your community? And an injunctive norms measure might ask, is wearing face masks in public approved of among adults in your community? Whereas for individual attitudes, we might ask about an individual's personal opinion. A measure for that might be something along the lines of, should people your age wear face masks in public? So next slide. I've briefly discussed how we talk about norms in the Passages Project. Taking that definition in hand, I wanted to quickly talk about some cross-cutting tasks that we've undertaken to take stock of the field of social norms measurement and evaluation. And as often is the case, we started with a very particular vision of these topics, but that vision has evolved as we've looked into the literature, as we've reached out to the community, and as we've learned from our own research on social norms in the Passages Project. So for example, we're currently analyzing and packaging the results of a systematic scoping review to examine the range and nature of evidence for norm shifting sexual and reproductive health and well-being interventions, and research that benefits adolescents and young adults in low and middle income countries. So two of the research questions that we have for this product and relevant for social norms measures and evaluation from this review are: one, what measures do we have to assess social norms? And two, what evidence do we have for the efficacy of adolescent SRH norm shifting interventions? Now, my purpose is not really to look at the results of this review in detail. We could do that at a later date, but really to just sort of remark on three very general findings. One, there are precious few manuscripts discussing social norms, measures, and evaluations, less than 25 in this review by our definition and criteria, with most of these being more qualitative in nature. Two, many of these manuscripts that we examine generally look at individual attitudes as a proxy for social norms. And three, there does seem to be an uptick in these manuscripts in the last 5 years, and especially the last 2. So there is a lot of growth in recent times in these topics in the literature. So next slide. So in addition to a scoping review, looking at the literature, we also reached out to social norms practitioners and institutions asking for one, examples and descriptions of norm shifting interventions. 2 of evaluations of norm shifting interventions and what those methodologies, details on those methodologies, and 3rd of social norms measures. And these can all be found on the results of all of this. Reaching out to social norms experts can be found on the Align website. So this really resulted in over 160 case studies of norm shifting interventions, with about half discussing some evaluation of the intervention's achievements in shifting norms or achievements in shifting behaviors, and about 40 with tools and measures related to social norms measurement, most often from qualitative methods or quantitative single item measures, and to a lesser extent from participatory methods or scales. So we're seeing more examples of both evaluation and measures from this task compared to the literature, but many norm shifting programs still seem to be done without explicit evaluations, not based on quality measures of social norms, a topic that I hope that we get to a little bit more in depth in our question and answers. So next slide. So next, based on our work in both Passages and the Learning Collaborative, we developed a document called the Resources for Measuring Social Norms, a practical guide for program implementers, also available on the Align website. In this document, we really tried to think about measurement and evaluation needs at various points in the intervention cycle. For example, there's guidance for a project that has little or no reliable evidence that social norms are affecting a behavior of interest, which we call the ACT phase. And we might suggest using something like our social norms exploration tool to help out in this phase. A second phase for when there's no guiding theory of change or conceptual model that accounts for norms, the define and align phase. A third for operationalizing a measurement and evaluation plan, the measure phase, and a fourth, understanding and acting when you finally have the data. So we do not really see this resource as a definitive guide per se, but there are practical and real world examples with measures and evaluation strategies, named measures and evaluation strategies tailored to a program's objectives and where they are in the project life cycle. So next slide. So based on this work and more, I'd like to simply and briefly summarize sort of 7 characteristics of a promising social norm measure that we've sort of learned and documented throughout our experience with Passages. So social norms measures are 1, specific about a concrete scenario and expected outcome. They refer to specific behaviors, refer to a reference group. If not, we see that as really an individual attitude. 4th, measures both injunctive and descriptive norms. I gave those definitions a little bit earlier. 5th, determines whether sanctions or sort of positive or negative consequences for breaking a norm exist and how much they matter. Social norms measures may take different forms. I'll talk about that very briefly. I'll talk about that shortly. And may measure collective norms, which more are aggregated attitudes rather than perceived norms. Next slide. So we've talked a little bit about our efforts to look in the literature and reaching out to experts, but we also wanted to discuss some of the measures that we've used to evaluate norm shifting interventions within the actual Passages project. So first, we developed quantitative scales for norms related to intimate partner violence, family planning, and gender roles to evaluate the Masculinité, Famille et Foi intervention, a faith-based norm shifting intervention in Kinshasa, through a process that involved a phase of formative work to assess the norms, reference groups, and sanctions relevant for each one of these 3 behaviors, building out a theory of change, developing quantitative items based on these steps and speaking with the community, piloting and pre-testing these items, and then conducting a factor analysis, which resulted in a number of domains, 2 for gender roles, 3 for women for intimate partner violence, and 2 for men. So there is a sex difference in those measures, and 2 for FP. And these scales performed well in validity and reliability tests and were used in our evaluation and have since been used in adaptations of the MFF intervention to other settings. So next slide. So whereas scales seem more appropriate for the MFF intervention, this is not the only technique that we've used. For example, we've used vignettes or hypothetical examples that make sense to a given population, a real world example, that are often used for sensitive topics and especially for very young adolescents. For example, in our grandmother project in Senegal, we developed a series of vignettes related to child marriage, early pregnancy, and girls' education through a relatively similar process as for scales. As you can see, we created a scenario with relevant details, stopped to ask some questions about descriptive and injunctive norms, so typical and appropriate behaviors. We introduced an action. In this example, the young girl states that she does not want to get married, and asked additional questions about the community's responses to the girl's actions to better understand sanctions and exceptions and other important elements of norms. So these two all but brief examples of measurement techniques are to demonstrate that at Passages, we do not really believe that there's necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to social norms measurement and evaluation, and the choice of measures really a balance between rigor and a project's needs and context. So next slide. So next, I'd like to shift to Passages experiences with two broader named types of evaluations rather than norms measures. First, we incorporated a youth participatory evaluation approach to evaluate the performance of Growing Up Great intervention in Kinshasa. In this project, the adolescents themselves acted as evaluators, collecting stories of significant change, really shifting the power differential and contributing to an added element of a better understanding of the intervention, really by exploring that black box to understand how intervention activities lead to expected outcomes. Now, there are a number of reasons to adopt this strategy, but our point today, this is an alternative methodology to a randomized control trial, for example, was very acceptable and worked quite well in this setting to help us understand the normative influences on the program's target behavior. So next slide. In a similar vein, we have also incorporated a realist evaluation lens or approach to two studies in Senegal and Niger. Realist evaluation really situates a projects within complex systems, asking what works for whom and in what context, rather than simply does it work. It's ideal for deeper understanding of norms change pathways and highlighting evidence gaps in those expected pathways. So for this and other reasons, this is another good alternative norm shifting evaluation methodology, particularly for making explicit norms change effects and outcomes, recognizing that projects operate within community social systems and that those that are for learning and that are more learning and program improvement focused. So next slide. So I'm coming down to the last little bit. So we have just some brief lessons that we're going to be putting out as our end of project learnings, that there's consensus on measuring social norms, which has grown over the Passages project years and can guide future research, evaluation, and norm shifting interventions. I've already spoke a little bit about these sort of good characteristics of a good norm. That researchers can quantitatively measure norms with high validity and reliability, but we still need more examples of practical approaches. There still are few valid and reliable normative measures that we've seen in the literature and by reaching out, and that in response to that, Passages has developed high quality measures through formative research, testing, and factor analysis. And then my last slide. My last slide. Oh. And I just want to briefly just finish up, I mentioned that participatory action research methods, as well as realist evaluations, can be sort of alternative methodologies. We're not just pushing randomized control trials, and there are other ways of looking at and measuring and assessing norm shifting and change in norm shifting. So thank you very much. I think I'll stop there and turn it over to a panel of practitioners that we've organized to speak to some of these issues.
Great. Thank you, Bryan. I guess the panel's up next, and we're going to spotlight people. So maybe I'll just pause a bit. And just let people know that there is the Q&A. Just remind you, there's the Q&A box if you have some questions. I see some questions that have already kind of started coming in from both Ben and Bryan and Rebecca's remarks. So let's just, while we're trying to do a spotlighted program, so you can sort of see a panel that we've been, that we wanted to now move to. So we're really moving to some reflections by people who have actually been directly involved in working with social norms and measurement, and from different perspectives. So we have Charlotte Lapsansky, who is from UNICEF, the SBC specialist. We have Lydia Murithi from Pathfinder, who's the Beyond Bias director, and they'll all be talking more about what they're doing. And Sadhvi Kalra from CARE, which is the Tipping Point program, their MEL advisor. So welcome panelists, and Bryan too, in case there are other questions. Welcome panelists, and really what we're trying to do is have you reflect on some of your experiences. So I'm asking, I would like each of you just to sort of reflect on 2 questions as we go through this first round. For the audience, if you have questions, feel free to put them in, and we'll take some questions as we close the webinar. But the first question is, have you thought about and used social norms measurement in your, how have you thought about and used social norms measurement in your work? And how has your thinking changed over the last 5 years? So our passage's time frame, but also there's been a lot of movement, as Ben was really talking about in the field more generally. Then the second question is, what do you see as the primary challenges about measuring social norms from your perspective regarding your work and your role? So we didn't actually decide who would go first, but Charlotte, why don't you go first and share your thoughts on those 2 questions?
Sure, happy to kick it off. Thank you very much. And good morning, evening, and afternoon to everyone on the call. Great to be here. So I'm going to talk about our work in UNICEF over the past 5 years to develop a measurement framework on social norms specific to FGM. So of course, social norms cuts across UNICEF's work, but a lot of our thinking around measurement has been focused on the context of child protection. And it's been especially taken up within the context of our work through the joint program with UNFPA on FGM. But we do hope that the work we've done in that context can be used to strengthen how we think about social norms in general and measurement specifically across some of our other areas as well. I'd say in the time span we're looking at, about 5 years ago, we were facing demand from 2 sides on how to make our measurement more robust, or demand to make our measurement more robust. One is that, our donors were very supportive of our approach of emphasizing long-term social norms change as a key pillar to addressing FGM. But they were rightfully kind of pushing us and encouraging us to find indicators that would help to show we were moving in the right direction in the short and medium terms. The second area where we were feeling the pressure to take on this issue was from our field offices, who were really hungry for clearer guidance on how to measure social norms. And in the absence of that guidance, we were seeing a lot of variation in the field. So different countries were taking on the issue. We're bringing in different partners to help them on this, and each of those partners was bringing their own perspective. So we were finding very different ways that our countries were thinking about the issue, which made it, of course, hard to have a holistic approach as a institution. Or we found countries that were attempting to measure norms, but were actually, when you looked at their instruments, were really getting more at the questions of attitudes, and they didn't have the expertise or guidance to push that forward into actually looking at norms. And then some of our offices were just at a loss and weren't measuring it at all. So we really saw that there was a need to kind of provide something. And I guess the challenge for us was that we needed a tool that would be both sensitive to the cultural specificities of the many different countries we're working in, but at the same time, provide some comparable kind of information and have a unified approach, even so that we're one program, even though we're working in different cultural contexts. And the other challenge we faced was that, we were thinking of the complexity of social norms and the huge number of constructs that we might need to take in to really fully get at social norms, some of which Bryan highlighted. We need to look at sanctions and rewards. We need to look at descriptive norms and injunctive norms, and we need to look at social networks. And so for us, a measurement tool would capture all those things, but our countries were saying it's too much. We want just a menu of indicators. We want to be able to pick and choose. So that was a tension that was a real challenge for us to kind of crack. The way it's evolved is out of this 5 years of work, we have last year launched the ACT framework for measuring FGM. And it includes quantitative, qualitative, and participatory approaches to measuring social norms. And it is in a menu structure, but there's also guidance on how to use that menu. So our hope is that people don't just pick one indicator and run, but they do look at how different indicators might interact with each other, even if they're not able to implement the entire framework. I did want to highlight, because Bryan brought it up, that one of the things that came out of this is that the participatory tools were really well received. So we actually have pulled those out of the framework and highlighted them and made a standalone guide on participatory approaches to measuring social norms. So I think that's something we're very proud that we've kind of been able to bring to our field and highlight. So I'll just raise a couple challenges that we faced while doing this work. One was we spent a lot of time, that's my 1 minute warning, okay. We spent a lot of time making sure that we were getting gender right, and it wasn't easy finding the right balance of, working with colleagues to really come to an agreement on how we position the relationship between gender norms and social norms, and making sure the gender constructs were wrapped in correctly. The second challenge we faced is scale at the systems level. How do we embed these kinds of measures into measurement systems? So it's not like a typical health measure, which can easily be brought into a national survey. Social norms is more difficult to embed in existing monitoring systems. So that's where we hope to go next. We're looking at how we can identify some of the indicators potentially from the ACT framework or some of the other streams of work we're doing, and bring them into population-based surveys so that we can start getting regular measures that go beyond things like people reached, and which we usually see in our SBC programs.
Great.
That's where we are. That's going ahead. We're supporting countries on taking this up, and also supporting how we can use these indicators in some of our other measurement systems. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. So Lydia, same two questions for you. Really, how has your thinking changed? What have you, as you're thinking of social norms measurement, what are some of the challenges that you see moving ahead?
Yeah, thank you for having me and for having this discussion. In fact, it's been extremely timely, because for the Beyond Bias project, what we've been doing, just to give you a very quick background before I go to the challenges so you understand, we are charged with the goal of designing and testing scalable solutions to address provider bias. And by far, the greatest driver of provider bias, and when I say provider bias, it's about provider bias in serving youth and adolescents with a contraception or sexual reproductive health services. And from our research, from our formative research or design research, by far social norms are the greatest drivers of provider bias. And so in developing, we spent a lot of time with the communities, with providers and their communities and young people, designing an intervention, and it's a totally brand new intervention. And by far the greatest challenge we've had is that of measuring bias and trying to measure bias quantitatively, specifically. Because for one, what we recognized very early on, and why provider bias has persisted, is because training is what has been happening as an intervention, and providers exactly know what to tell you. So there's such a desirability bias to begin with when you're talking to providers in trying to assess whether they're biased or not, or whether their attitudes and behaviors and where they are on that. So that is one thing, which then leads you to needing then to talk to young people or the clients who are being served by the providers who we are targeting, to try and understand whether the services have been, are any different or any better because of the intervention we developed. And that's where really the rubber hit the road. And it's very, very challenging to measure bias at the client level, especially quantitatively. And the main thing here is that we don't even understand the difference between young people who come to the facility versus those who don't come to the facilities, and how they differ in terms of how they react to provider attitudes and behaviors. And also there is a lack of understanding. For instance, when a young person says provider bias is a barrier for them in terms of accessing contraception, is it because they went to the facility and they were denied, or they were chased away, or they were given a method they didn't want, or they were given a method and then they went back and the method didn't work, so they were angry, or they experienced, they got the method of their choice, but then were talked badly or reprimanded by providers, so then they went and told their peers, or then the peers learned about it, and so they're not coming. So the pathways are very convoluted and confusing, which makes measuring it so difficult at the facility level. And so one thing I want to highlight as it relates to this conversation, and I think Ben alluded to it, is a professional, what I see a professional norm or a field norm that has really come to fore for me. And that is the tensions between quantitative and qualitative methodologies, research methods, and how much the field is so hell-bent and desperate, almost unnecessarily, honestly, for quantitative methodologies. For over decades, we've documented provider bias as an issue. And over 4 years, we are in communities. We're in communities and talking to providers and young people, and learning provider bias is still an issue. Yet when it comes to measuring it, because this is an RCT, we are so paralyzed, or the project almost got so paralyzed by the fact that you couldn't measure it quantitatively. And so the question I want to pose here is, what really, how do we make decisions? How do we arrive to decisions about what method we apply when we're measuring our social norms? And what drives that decision? Is it donor needs for RCTs, our own interest in RCTs, or is it the need or the problem we are trying to solve, and what should actually be more important and more highlighted? So I guess we need to check ourselves. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Great, thanks. Two really great reflections. Let's move now to Sadhvi, who will talk about it from your perspective, also from different perspectives, so that I hope that will also bring some more questions. Go ahead. Sadhvi, welcome.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone, for setting the stage for these conversations so well. So to speak quickly about, CARE and the Tipping Point Project, I would just take, a few seconds to say that weakening harmful social norms has been central to the Tipping Point initiative at CARE. And this initiative focuses on reducing the rates of child marriage by working on weakening harmful social norms around this practice, and also building girls' agency to voice their rights and decision-making power. The Tipping Point intervention is actually also an RCT being evaluated using a 3-arm cluster randomized controlled trial. The intervention arms actually differ in the way that, of the 2 intervention arms that we have, one arm is exposed to an advanced and enhanced social norms change component, which involves the communities, different reference groups in the communities in a more synchronized manner. And then we have a control arm and another intervention arm, which has a reduced social norms change component. We are hoping that when the results are out sometime mid-2022, we will be able to see if particular interventions around social norms, targeted interventions have, change the behavioral outcomes in question. And it has been a very interesting journey for CARE, for our project, and getting influenced by the social norm measurement theoretical advancements that have been happening in the field in the last 5 to 10 years, I would say. CARE has been working towards identifying norms, consciously designing intervention, measuring them in the most effective ways. We were actually first looking at, what is a roadblock in changing behaviors, and norms became a big question there. Like, are we talking about the norms at all? That led to stellar work by CARE colleagues and existing theoretical foundations. I know Ben was also involved, who's here. That led us to develop the social norms analysis platform, which specifically was piloted then in Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, and now it's actually being used in the 10 countries that CARE has been working on. And now we're using this, knowledge that we have gained on, from a lot of participatory research, exploratory research that we did to design more structured implementation. However, not discounting the fact that participatory approaches are extremely, necessary in understanding norms. And why I say this is because, to quickly put it out, that, when we do research, especially when we are doing RCT research on assessing social norms, one of the biggest challenges that we have come across is recognizing and measuring the impact of multiple norms on the behavioral outcomes of interest, and then teasing out the degree of impact of a norm on a behavior. Or a set of related behaviors. Because I tell you, we started with thinking, which are the behaviors that we want to change and why are they not changing? Where is the roadblock there? Oh, the norms are there. Why are the norms not changing? Or what is it that we need to change that particular norm? And social norms don't work in isolation. Norms are embedded, in a system of structural drivers, and they intersect thus each other and influence behaviors, and not in a linear way. However, sometimes when devising interventions, there's a common approach to tackle that particular negative behavior and pass out certain proximal norms, which has the strongest influence on the behavior of interest. Thus, we saw many times that it was easier to focus on certain proximal norms, the normative and empirical expectations around that particular norm, and the perceived consequences to assess the direct influence of that particular norm on a particular behavior. But that we are very conscious of the fact that that leaves the influence of other norms and contextual realities out. So evaluating these interventions thereof, it becomes really imperative to be cognizant of this nuance, I feel, and approach the impact assessment in more complex ways, keeping in mind the multiple norms at play and their degree of influence on behaviors in question. And also taking that knowledge and talking about, how are we hoping for organized diffusion when we talk about change in social norms at a sustainable level, at scale, but also keeping in mind that if we are doing an RCT, that same diffusion becomes sometimes challenging because norms transcend boundaries. Norms are not limited to a region or, a particular boundary of community, etc. If I have the
Great.
time, okay.
Can you just finish up to 10 seconds? Give us a final thought.
I just want to say we have so many examples of how looking at one particular norm could have taken us to a very different direction, but because we were looking at multiple proximal norms and a larger context better, I think evaluating those really, really helped us in our work. And I'm very happy to share some of those insights later. I'm just going to stop there.
Great. Thanks so much to the three of you. Are there any, hearing each other speaking, because you're all coming at it from different perspectives, but actually there's some commonalities across in terms of challenges. Any further thoughts having heard what each other is saying? We can spend about a minute if you've got just some reactions.
I think a quick question I may have to the rest of the panelists is, again, I do understand there's an importance for both methods, and both methods do play an important part in research and in evaluation. But what does everyone else have to say about these skewness that we do have towards quantitative methodologies? And please understand that I do know that we talk about mixed methods as the gold standard, but even how we apply mixed methods is mostly quantitative work sprinkled with quotes here and there from qualitative. Sometimes I feel like we're not as intentional about having qualitatives come through. And going back to what Ben was saying about West versus Indigenous, most of the conversations that we would have to be able to engage Indigenous voices are qualitative. So what do we have to say about that?
Any thoughts before, and then we're going to have to probably have time for maybe maybe one
may I come in?
audience question, but go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation. I'm glad to be having it. And it's making me reflect on the thinking we've done on the participatory measurement pieces. And you know, I like what Ben was saying, but thinking about Western versus Indigenous knowledges and how much potential these participatory approaches have to bring that up. And one of the exercises we have in there is actually working with the community to define whether or not something even is a norm. You know, and listening to this conversation, I'm thinking more about the power of those kinds of exercises. So rather than us coming in and saying, you know, this is a normative issue and we're going to measure it and understand it, we work with the community and have them identify what are the normative issues that matter to them, and is it really normatively driven, or is there something else going on, and involving them in creating that knowledge and reality before we jump in and then start, you know, assuming what's a norm and how to measure it. So I think that's a lot of powerful threads coming out of that discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that, piggyback on that, and say that the extensive amount of complexity around social norms and the fact that they're not linear in affecting, you know, influencing behaviors has always driven us particularly to focus a lot on qualitative measures. And it comes, and, you know, deciding which questions to ask on which norms also came from an extensive community participatory analysis, as Charlotte is saying, asking which norms are there and which norms are most influential in a particular behavior. I absolutely agree that should not be that, you know, quantitative is at the center and the qualitative, you know, is sprinkled around. I think I personally believe it's equally important, if not more. I'm going to stop there.
And I think that's a commonality that all of us, including Passages, have, sort of this last reflection. So as you've been talking, I'm just been looking at the questions and answers. We only have time for one, and I just picked one. I'm sorry, they're all great, but I think it's interesting given this reflection. You know, if we're looking towards norm shifting, we're trying to bring some rigor into the measurement of social norms. How are you trying to, or have you thought about how you're bringing in new norms, the measurement of new norms that may be arriving due to the community reactions to the norm shifting interventions that you're talking about? Is there space to bring in measurement of the new norms that emerge from communities as change starts to happen?
I think, if I may go fast, if you don't mind, part of it for us has been actually to have the courage to question existing surveys that do exist. Because I think more than not, we are very quick to question qualitative. Again, you can tell where this is headed, but we're very quick to question information that comes in qualitatively and dismiss it. We're very dismissive of it as, you know, anecdotal, or is it emotional quotes here and there, but we don't really look at surveys that have existed that actually, and even look at their effectiveness, and reassess them. And I think that's where most holes for us have come out of, that these tools actually need to be revamped. They need to be rethought, reworked again. But I think it just goes unchecked because it's, again, this shift or this skewness.
And Charlotte, Sadhvi, Bryan, any final thoughts before we move to, we're going to have to close this really interesting session. Go ahead.
I will give a quick example of, you know, I wouldn't say that it was a surprise for us. There were a lot of norms when we were starting that we felt needed discussion, needed investigation, but there were many reasons why we did not get deeper into those. And we always knew that these might come up and these will impact our findings, our analysis, our narrative, which is the community building the narrative instead of us. So there was always a scope of recognizing that there could be a lot more that could come in, and recognizing also that that might not be visible so easily in the quantitative measures. That is why I'm always a believer of qualitative measures. And you can, you know, separately have a section discussion just on what are the things that we did not expect and what came out of that, and work further through those.
Charlotte, Bryan, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that I think, well, I guess I have two. One is the importance of tracking change in the norms over time. And for that, it's related to the things I was saying about how do we make sure to embed some of these measures in existing measurement systems so that they do get regularly tracked at scale. But that's a little different than capturing the new norms, which you said. So I think it's a combination of doing that tracking over change and then making sure that our norms measurements systems are linked to our community engagement work, because it's through that regular community engagement work where we'll be seeing how these changes are actually rippling and how they're creating new dynamics in the community and where we need to be focusing next.
Bryan, or should we close this really interesting session? Thank you so much.
I want to make sure that we get enough time to
So maybe
more things that people are interested in, but echo all of the things that this wonderful panel has said, and hopefully I've demonstrated that within the Passages project, it sort of depends upon the context, it depends upon the situation, and we've used multiple techniques, multiple methodologies to take a look at some of these things, and they each kind of have their time and a place, and just we're really sort of flexible within that within the Passages project with regards to methods. But yeah, I'd like to potentially move over and hear from the audience in terms of what they'd like to hear more about.
Yeah.
well, that was
No,
that was the one question. So now I think we're going to move. There was only time for one question, but now we're going to move, I think, to the Menti poll. But first, with these webinars, you can't really clap, and I would have clapped for Ben, and I would have clapped for Bryan, and I'm clapping for you symbolically.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, and thank you to all the panelists. We will send out, when we send out the recordings of this webinar, we'll send out all the answered questions, and we'll answer the questions that we didn't get a chance to. But I think the amazing questions and conversations that this sparked will lead to a series of 2 or 3 smaller follow-on technical consultations that will be all just questions and discussions. And it seems like there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions to answer. So we're going to send you a Menti link and ask you which of the measurement techniques and methods would you like to learn and discuss more about? So that'll be the first question, and let me send the Menti link in the chat. And then after that, there will also be an opportunity to say anything that we haven't mentioned. So is there some method that we haven't mentioned, then please go and let us know there. So Catherine, could you share the Menti screen now so we can just get a sense of where kind of the interest lies? Should we have already, so yeah, if you just have to present, it should be good. Okay, and as we're voting, I also just wanted to let everyone know that we will be having, it looks like a lot of interest in youth-led participatory research. I see Susan's excited. We will be having at least 2 more webinars as we share our learnings through Passages. The next one will be on Scale Up. And then the last one will be on our end of project learnings, kind of as they cross the legacy areas that we have classified ourselves as contributing to, and that will include evaluation and measurements where there seems to be a lot of interest. So please, if you haven't already, I'll send a link for signing up for the Passages newsletter where you can get information on these webinars and all the resources that we send out. And there, if you go to the next page, Catherine, I think we should be able to see the other. So yeah, I think if you click the forward arrow. Okay. Yeah, so this, as you're adding, you should be able to go to the second screen. If that's not coming up for you, Rebecca said, put other topics in the chat and also reach out to us because we'll be sending out the recording and we'll be able to incorporate anything else. Yeah, one thing I saw in the questions that we were talking about the difference between gender and social norms.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that everyone else can see the chat, right? So you can just see, so we don't have time to
the Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is the hour. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to our speakers and panelists, and we hope to see you soon.
Bye.